One of the sensory experiences that you focus on is a restful state, which is the darkness, brightness in front of or behind your closed eyes. I say that represents a blank mental screen. Now, although that darkness, brightness could be stable, in which case actually that can be good. That becomes what's called a kasina, and that can stabilize consciousness and become a basis for absorption states. On the other hand, very often that darkness, brightness is sort of swirling, vibrating, and whatever. That's impermanence, that's flow. And most people, at least occasionally, get that sense of flow in the blank on their mental screen. And if you focus on it, the more you focus on it, the more fluid it becomes. It becomes, sort of massages you, it comforts you, and so forth. So my generic term for continuous type changes is flow. And then if something disappears, that's gone, vanishing. So in the restful aspect of image space, there may be flow. Images come. Typically they disappear, so that's a vanishing. Even when they're rising, they may fade in, fade out, melt, morph. So there's usually even if there's image activity, there's some sense of change. What can be really interesting, this doesn't happen to a lot of people, but sometimes you can have mental images that they're real. They're like alive. They're animated from inside, just like living things. They're 3D, and they just move as though God's hand were like inside a puppet making this thing animated. Sometimes people get freaked out when that happens. But if you just get fascinated with the flow of expansion and contraction in those realistic images, then you're going to go to the source. That's going to take you to the formless doing that molds not only those images, but the visual, so-called material world, everything. In other words, if you ever have, not that this happens very often, but sometimes people, quote, see spirits and whatever, there's two ways that you can relate to that. One is, well, it's sort of a message, and you can honor its content, but that's the world of powers, and that has its place, but what we would prefer is that you not be so interested in that message, but be interested in the movement of the medium. Because when you're seeing spirits, you're very close to seeing the Great Spirit, but you have to let go of your preoccupation with the spirits and just see the underlying pure flow of formless energy that is what is behind making them seem so real. I know half the people hearing this are, I'll never experience that. I never experienced that. Okay, and the other half is, I hope I don't experience that. Well, some people experience this. And if you do, you'll know how to make use of it as a liberation path, as opposed to either something that wigs you out or something that shunts you off into a lesser God. Let's put it that way. So in your visual thinking, either the restful aspect of the blank or the active aspect of image activity, there could be flow, things could vanish, things could change and move and melt and morph, and you could decide to focus on that and to sort of ride on that, get fascinated with it. The more you focus, the more pronounced it gets. That's the theme of flow and go. In visual thinking, how about auditory thinking? Well, sometimes there's not too much happening there. There's a kind of quiet, but then there's an underlying current, a kind of buzz. That's a kind of vibratory flow in the subtle auditory processing. In Tibetan, that's called Namdok Okjing. They actually have a term for that, a technical term. Namdok means thinking, and ok means underneath or beneath, and je means a stream. So I took a great pleasure in finding out that this thing that I had always called subtle processing and made part and parcel, as you know, of the techniques, sure enough, in Tibet, it was known, and they have a technical term for it. And somebody told me that, a Tibetan scholar, a couple months ago. Anyway, so you can have that subtle sort of vibratory flow in talk space. And even when you have explicit words in talk space, they may boom in talk space. That's expanding. That's expansive flow. They may grip and hold you. That's contractive flow. So in your auditory thoughts, you could have flowing experiences. And what's interesting about what I call talk or auditory thinking has some sort of interesting characteristics. One is it's, for most people, the hardest to stop. And not that I'm advocating you stop it, but if you try to stop it, it's hard to stop it. But it's very easy to initiate. You can think about anything you want in talk space. You can repeat a mantra or some litany, and there's a lot of control in initiating talk. It's really hard to sort of stop doing it once it gets going. The other interesting thing is that talk is probably the easiest sensory phenomenon within which to notice abrupt vanishings. People will often report this to me as though it were a problem. It's like, as soon as I notice my internal talk, it disappears. What am I doing wrong? It's not a problem, that's an insight into impermanence. So you can note the vanishings, the gones. So as you can see, the mind is mental experience, visual thinking and auditory thinking, has a lot of potential for impermanence, for focusing on the theme of change. How about the body? Well, if you sort of zoom out and cover your whole body, it's pretty hard to keep the whole thing in awareness and perfectly stable. It tends to puff out a little here, pull in a little bit there. That's flow. Sometimes people get tingling, vibration, undulation. That's flow. A problem that people frequently report in the body is there's pressure. And people usually blame themselves for it. It's like, well, something's trying to expand, but I'm resisting it, kind of thing. They make themselves responsible. If you have pressure, you can ask yourself, is it inward, outward, or bidirectional? And instead of making it a problem, just look upon it as force flow. Pressure is actually momentum flux. So you can look upon that as a kind of flow. Einstein did. So instead of making pressures something I'm resisting or I'm fighting or I'm whatever, it's just there's an outward force. So that's an expansion. Even if there's no volumetric change, it is an expansive flavor of flow in that force is flowing out, pressure force. Inward, okay, and just yield to it. It might make it worse for a little while, but then at some point you get a sense that, yes, that's not a problem. That's part of the flow of nature too.